Good afternoon. Let's call to order the Administration and Finance Committee. Can we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Dr. Bofi? Is she here?
No.
Not present. Mr. Castile? Here. Mr. Castile is in attendance. Dr. Davis? Here. Dr. Davis is present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Davis is present. Miss Ashley Ellis? Present. Miss Ellis is present. Mr. Garvey? Here. Mr. Garvey is present. Miss Holloway? Here. Miss Holloway is present. Mr. Morris? Here. Mr. Morris is present. Miss Orange Jones? Present. Miss Orange Jones is present. Mr. Rock? Present. Mr. Rock is present. And Miss Doris Boche
Not present.
is not present. You have a quorum.
Thank you. What is our first item of business?
Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 5.1, 5.2, 6.1, and 7.1.
We need a motion, please. Mr. Rock, any second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Castile. Any objection? Hearing none, motion carries. Next item, please.
Your first item is on page 41, item 4.1, consideration of an update report regarding school systems and schools in noncompliance with the 70% instructional requirement for fiscal year 2018-2019. The recommendation is to receive the report.
Thank you. I need a motion to receive, please. Motion by Mr. Castile. Need a second. Mr. Rock. Do we have any comments on this? Members, this is a report that we've asked for, so hope you'll avail yourself of this information. Mr. Castile, do you have a question?
I do. I'm struggling. Some of the schools are saying in response to the 70% instructional requirement that there is declining in enrollment, and that is, if I recall correctly, that's impacting the 70%, their ability to meet the 70% rule. Do we have any insight into it? Because there's a number of schools that are districts that are saying that. Are we seeing some significant declines in certain districts that's impacting their ability to meet that number?
Superintendent, can you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, we are seeing some level of decline in terms of student enrollment throughout the state. Ms. CNO and her team are working through that, and we intend to be able to provide essentially certified numbers back to school systems after the turn of the year. I don't know the degree in which that has caused an issue with these particular systems here. One of the factors I will call out is simply at this point, the only thing that we can do is provide you with the listing of the systems that do not meet the 70% requirement of dollars spent instructionally. However, there's not specifically a ramification for the system for not meeting that presently according to how we operate.
Yeah. Just, I noticed Madison Parish, Morehouse, Poincaré Parish, St. Helena, Tinsall, so a number of them give the same reason, and that's the declining enrollment. Just trying to figure out a little bit more about what that's all about. So if at some point someone can offer a little clarification, it would be helpful.
And I think, Mr. Castillo, if you look at some of the schools that you've called out, if you look at the number of years in which they have not met the 70% requirement, it's lengthy. And so, I know that those school boards and superintendents probably have some important decisions to make to ensure that they are operating as efficiently as they can to serve the needs of students. But, frankly, this is an area where we have to make sure that we have more dollars going into the instructional environment than presently exists.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
I'll take a moment to comment on this item just for what it's worth. Mr. Castile, something to consider also is that while the superintendent noted this is not a list that is a precursor for some sort of action relative to the fact that they're not meeting that threshold, it is fairly obvious to think there's some of the commonalities of those districts relative to their rural nature, population size, and then simple math, fractional math, numerators and denominators in terms of overhead. And there's a discussion I would recall relative to how do we consider management of districts that are so small and or that are losing populations relative to, is there a consolidation that can occur for geographically close districts or some other methodology. I know that conversation began at some point, probably about a year ago, Other priorities have probably been in the way of that conversation continuing this calendar year. I would encourage you to consider what that may look like from further discovery and conversation around what could be done to help offset some of those overhead costs, which would in turn, as Superintendent pointed out, help get the dollars back into the classroom more.
Fair enough.
Any other comments from the board relative to this item? Any objection to the item? Hearing no objection, the motion will carry. Next item, please.
On page 104, item 5.3, consideration of fiscal dialogues as a result of the fiscal risk assessment process for fiscal year 2019-2020. Recommendation is to receive.
A motion to receive, members. Ms. Holloway, second by Mr. Rock. Any discussion from the board or questions on this item? Again, much like the last item, it's an information report.
I do have a question.
Mr. Castillo, go ahead.
And I apologize, it may have actually been on the last item, but on page 55 of our packet as it relates to the budget, I noticed that in salaries for 2019.
Hold on, Mr. Castillo, let me make sure what item that is on.
That's a consent item.
That's what
This is on a consent item that's already been moved through.
That's why I beg your indulgence to ask the question.
Is it something that we would want to follow up after this committee meeting with the superintendent, or do you want to have it?
If it's a quick response, I don't mind asking now.
Let's see, if we need to move it beyond this committee, we'll do so. Go ahead with your question, sir.
I just wanted to know there was some program because the number from 2019 to 2021 jumped for about $10 million. And it looks like that's something programmatic, not just that there were pay raises, but something more structural that happened. Do you happen to know offhand?
Yeah, Ms. C&O can come up and speak more directly to that, or Dr. Timmel. However, a portion of it has to do with a large number of the grants that were received by the department, specifically early childhood. Another factor to consider, and Ms. C&O can speak to this too, is these are not necessarily expended funds, but requested funds. And furthermore, you also have, moving forward, the response relative to the governor's pay raise for employees who are part of state agencies. But Ms. C&O is here. She can certainly go into that.
Good afternoon, Beth, C&O.
Good afternoon.
So when the budget was developed, we are requested, it's done so early. So for 1920, we anticipated getting some additional grants, which we did. At the point at which we requested that, we had to request additional money in case those grants entailed salary information, because we would have no permission to spend the grants under that particular expenditure code without that permission. So that anticipated those grants. That is not necessarily how much, will be spent in the end, because, some are still being developed at this point and implemented, but that is permission that we have to spend that money in that particular expenditure category of salaries.
Okay, great, thank you. Don't mean to delay the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. C&O.
It is not an increase of staff at the
I
department,
didn't think
nor
of that,
significant pay raise issues
Government budget.
that one could.
$10 million I had to ask.
No, it was programmatic and/or governor's salary increase.
Great, thank you, sir.
All right, so we have, I believe, on the floor, the motion to receive this report for item 5.3. Are there any additional questions on this particular item, or any questions on this item? Any objection to the motion? Hearing none, the motion will carry. What is our next item?
On page 115, item 5.4, consideration of LDE contracts of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
Need a motion to approve, members?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Castillo, second by Mr. Rock. Do we have any questions from members relative to this item? Ms. Orange-Jones?
Just a recusal.
We'll note your recusal for the item. Any other recusals for this item? Any questions relative to this item? With no questions, no other recusals, any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, motion carries. What is our next item?
On page 141, item 5.5, consideration of federal and state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, Type 5 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations, competitive, formula, and other. Recommendation is to approve.
Need a motion, members? Mr. Rock, thank you. Second by Ms. Holloway. The motion is to approve the recommendation. Do I have any questions from board members on any of these items? I'd like to note the recusal of Ms. Ellis. Do I have any other recusals to be noted? No recusals. Any questions? Seeing no questions, are there any objections to the motion? And with no objection, the motion will carry. What is our next item?
On page 179, item 6.2, consideration of HE funding cycle activities, the HE budget reduction for fiscal year 2020-21, and the HE budget for fiscal year 2021-22. Recommendations are to approve the HE budget reduction for fiscal year 2020-2021 as outlined, and approve the HE program and budget for fiscal year 2021-22.
Members, we can take this either together or separately, but I'll give you just a moment to look at that, and if you want to make the motion, just let me know if you're making it for the first recommendation or for both, and I can be happy to explain those. The first, to bring your attention back, I know we're waiting on the motion to get this on the floor, but for context, if you recall the last meeting, we discussed the fact that you had here representatives from the Treasurer's Office that the AG fund is taking a nosedive, and therefore we've got to do a reduction in programs. So what you see as the first recommendation is that reduction for the existing budget on AG. The second recommendation is to approve the recommended budget for the next year for AG, which is 15 million, which is a low number relatively speaking for HG, but AG. So the two recommendations, then one is to adopt the budget reductions necessary to meet the projections for AG for this year, and the second recommendation is to approve the budget for the next year for AG. That said, do I have one motion or two from the
I
floor?
don't mind making the motion to take them both, but I do have a question after that.
Certainly. So the motion for both, I need a second. Mr. Rock seconds that. Mr. Castile, go ahead.
On page 171, and just for clarification, and timing, it references the BESE 2015-2020 strategic plan goals, and that just sort of prompted me in terms of, now that we're wrapping up 2020, we'll be beginning a process as it relates to strategic planning as it references this as being a 5-year period ending 2020.
Ms. Davis, you want to speak to that item? That question?
I think I alluded to this at one point. You actually make your revisions to the plan in the third year. So we actually had to revise the strategic plan in whatever year that was, 17, 18. So it's extended out now through 2025, but we've already done that work. So we will revisit it in a couple of years. We could certainly discuss things in the meantime, but it's already been extended out. In other words, it has not been expired next year. We've already submitted the plan.
All right, this is just historical. This is for the plan that covered 2015-20.
Yes.
And then we have strategic plan going forward another 5 years?
Yes, we already have that in place. But at year 3, and again, certainly at any time, with this board can start looking at that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I just didn't want you to think it was like ending and had like something going on right now that needs to be done.
Great, that's helpful because that's what it suggested when I read this, but I appreciate that.
Very confusing.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members? With no other questions, any objections to the motion? Hearing no objection, the motion will carry. Next item.
On page 185, item 8.1, consideration of the 2020 BESE Annual Legislative Report regarding educator certification, revocations, and records reviews. Recommendation is to approve the report and authorize the executive director to submit the report, including the results of record reviews conducted at the December 2020 BESE meetings, to the House and Senate Education Committees by December 31st, 2020.
Like a motion to approve the report and authorize its submittal. Is that the motion you have, Mr. Orange-Jones? Need a second for that? Mr. Rock, thank you so much. Any questions, members? The motion is made by Ms. Orange-Jones, seconded by Mr. Rock. If there are no questions, is there any objection to the motion? With no objection, the motion will carry. What's our next item?
That concludes your agenda.
Thank you, members.